Trey Kay here, and you're listening to Us and Them from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX. We're the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us and sometimes the things that can bring us together. I started the Us and Them podcast back in 2015, and not long after we launched, I started working with a producer named Laurie Stern. Laurie lives in Minnesota, and we worked together for years before I ever met her in person. Actually, it was about 7 years before we met face to face. As you know, I've shared a lot of my personal story on this show, and Laurie has done much to help me shape those stories in a beautiful way. But the thing is, I haven't known much about Laurie's story, particularly the story about her family, and more specifically, the story about her son, Diego. Recently, Laurie and Diego have produced a fantastic podcast series where they tell their incredibly compelling story about international adoption and the consequences for everyone involved. All I can say is that it may be one of the ussiest and themiest stories I've ever heard. I'd like you to hear a little bit of this podcast, which is a production of Something Else and Sony Music Entertainment. It's called Defining Diego.
My name is Diego Shikai Luke, and this is me when I was 10 years old. My dad and I were making a video.
No, my name's Diego, but I'm from the Tsutsuhil tribe, so they would call me Atiko.
I had just learned another one of my names, Atiko. That means Diego in Tsutsuhil, a Maya language. In the video, there's a huge lake behind me. This is where I was born, in a Mayan village called Santiago Atitlan, on the shores of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. But it's not where I was raised. In 1999, when I was a baby, I was adopted by a white American couple in Minnesota. In a lot of ways, this is the story of me growing up.
Spell me a word and I'll see if I can guess what it is. Sock.
Sock, yes.
Comemos 3 huevos con pan tostado y bebés.
8th grade, but I think if I can finish this year stronger than I have ever done, I'll be set for 9th grade.
Unlike most adoptees, I know a lot about where I come from and who my birth family is, partly because of these recordings. And that's because of one person especially.
Yeah, that's me. I'm Laurie, Diego's mom, and I'm a reporter.
You've been recording me almost all of my life. And it wasn't just the important stuff, like our trips to my birth family's town in Guatemala. I mean, you recorded everything. My hockey games and play dates, me messing around with the pets.
My name is Diego, and this is my dog, Dinwiddie. He's a basketball-playing dog. He can play basketball. He can catch a really good ball.
I love listening back to you when you were a little kid. But we both know that your story isn't about how cute you were, although you were really cute.
No, the story isn't cute at all, though that's how adoption stories, especially international adoption, always sound. They have this rosy glow. A poor single mother in some country gives her baby up for adoption so they can both survive. And then a usually white, middle-class American family steps in and takes the baby out of a life of poverty and into a life of opportunity. The kid is saved, but that's just not how it works. The truth? Well, it's a lot more complicated and a lot less rosy.
We just heard an excerpt from the podcast series Defining Diego. And I wanted to talk to Laurie and her son Diego about their show and this very complicated story. I want to thank you so much for your willingness to speak with me. Laurie, can you tell our listeners what your fantastic podcast, Defining Diego, is all about?
You know, Trey, I can actually do that because in the course of making it, I figured out the answer. Our podcast is about the rise and fall of international adoption. It's about our son and co-host, Diego, figuring out how he's going to straddle his two worlds, the Maya world and the Minnesota world. And it's about our relationship with his biological family. It's about those three things.
It seems as though your mom, my friend Laurie, has been filming and recording you since the first time she laid eyes on you. Is that something that you remember right from the very beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I never really had a choice in. You know, I always grew up with a microphone and a camera kind of in my face, and I don't really think I knew how unique or different that was until I kind of got older. Yeah, I mean, as long as I can remember, I've always been recorded.
So you were comfortable with it? Were you ever annoyed by it, or?
I wouldn't say I was comfortable with it, just because, like, you know, as you get into the series and on, some stuff happens in my life, and you know, one of the big things was I never felt like I got time to process anything that was, you know, going on in my life without it being on camera or being recorded. It was kind of like, how are you feeling now? And I think that's kind of when it got a little frustrating for me, but looking back on it, I am really glad to have this tape.
Well, whose idea was it to compile this story and share it with the public?
All that goes to my mom, Laurie, because, you know, she's, as you said in the introduction, in your wonderful introduction of us, that Laurie has been recording this for a long time and doing stories on our family, and so it was all her idea.
Laurie, can you tell me a little bit? I mean, was it always your intention, like almost from the very beginning, that this was something that you intended to do? I mean, I know documentarians like you and I, we're just constantly rolling tape on things and are we going to use this or not? But did you always have the intention?
I started shooting because I wanted to show my husband, Dan, our new little baby, because I was with him and Dan wasn't. And then we got stuck in Guatemala for 9 months, and Diego was doing all the baby things, and Dan and my friends and family were missing it. So, of course, I recorded it. And then the more I got to see kind of behind the curtain, the more I thought, you know, I was a journalist and I was a curious person. And I thought, oh, people might want to know about these complexities in adoption. They might want to know some of what I was seeing while I was in Guatemala.
So let me back up a little bit. When did you decide that you wanted to adopt a child?
Well, you know, I was in my 40s. I had an adventure-filled, do whatever I felt like, journalistic, pursuing all kinds of relationships and curiosities. And then, boom, the biological clock chimed, and all I wanted was a baby, and Dan and I couldn't have one. International adoption was just one of the choices that people who couldn't have biological kids were making. So it seemed logical. I had been to Guatemala. I felt like it was an accessible place that we could visit if our child had that interest. And I cared about Guatemala. I had covered, for example, what was the Minnesota National Guard doing there in 1994, years before Diego was born. It was a big decision to become a mother, but to adopt internationally, not so much.
So there you are. You're a journalist, and you are in Guatemala, and from what I could tell from listening to the podcast, you're there to retrieve your son, and your husband Dan is not with you, and so initially you are just doing what you do as an audio video journalist, and you're just basically recording what is happening so that he actually can see this new experience. Is that right? That's
right, and it's something we had done together because we met at a TV station where we were both in the business.
So much of this podcast is about Diego's life and how much he is really kind of grappling with being an adopted kid who's living in the United States in Minnesota, but also coming from a rich heritage in Central America. But what we also learn a great deal about the international adoption process. I wanted to know, why did you choose to adopt from Guatemala?
I loved Guatemala. I had been there and I knew people there. I knew a little bit about the Maya people there, and I'm not sure I considered anywhere else. The other thing about Guatemala was there were so many babies available. The country had a reputation of being a place where you could get your babies young, and that was a good thing because then you could attach to them younger in life and they to you, and it was just a healthier way to be a parent, we all thought.
So you go to Guatemala and you are there, you're dealing with the handlers who are helping connect you with your son. Can you just tell us what that process was like?
Yeah, I mean, I made friends with them. They were concerned because we had a lawyer who wasn't being straight with us or with them. And I think everybody wanted to get paid. I wanted to get my baby home. And we couldn't figure out what was the problem. Our only contact was the lawyer that the agency had contracted with. And he just kept saying a few more weeks, and then maybe a month, and then maybe a couple more months. And meanwhile, the agency, I think, was a little concerned about my curiosity and what was going on with our case. So they kept giving me kind of deals. Like, they made it possible for me to stay in Diego's foster home for a few weeks. And then after that, they hired me to help facilitate meetings between adoptive parents and foster and biological parents if all the parties wanted to get together. And so being that person, and Diego won't remember, but he was often in my arms or in our little backpack, it was another way to see this fascinating world.
You are there, and you've met up with Diego. You're kind of staying near his foster mother, and you're waiting. I mean, how long did you expect the process to go?
Well, I went in the middle of February, and the agency told us it would be 3 weeks. Nobody had any idea that it would actually be 9 months.
What was it like just going through that process?
It was hell. If I had known that we were going to be together in Guatemala for 9 months, I would have enjoyed it. It's a beautiful country. I'd be a fluent Spanish speaker. But we just kept thinking, because that's what we were being told, just another couple weeks. And it went on that way from February to October. In October, we got a yellow light, and then we got a green light to get on a plane and come home right before Thanksgiving.
So you're there in Guatemala, and your husband is back in Minnesota. What was that like? Did it put a strain on your relationship?
You know, the phone bills were ridiculous. I think they were over $2,000 a month because we talked every night. And that's, there was no WhatsApp 24 years ago. He came and visited 5 times. One time was around Mother's Day. It was kind of sad. Another time was Diego's first birthday. Also kind of sad because Diego was walking by then and Dan had to get on a plane and go home. And finally, the fifth and last time was to bring Diego home.
So eventually you get everything worked out and you're preparing to take Diego back to Minnesota. And that takes me to one of the moments that really stood out in the series for me. And that's when you chose to interview Diego's birth mother. And I'd like to listen to a bit of that encounter and then speak about it on the other side.
It was back before we left Guatemala in 1999. It felt like the right thing to do. I wanted to thank your birth mother.
Isabel.
Yeah, Isabel. I wanted you to someday know we'd met. It was really important to me. I hate hearing this tape. It felt awful at the time, and in retrospect, I can see all my mistakes. I thought I was just documenting what was happening. But now I feel terrible for bringing a video camera.
I mean, it's just you and your gear. That's just how you roll.
It happened on this big empty lot outside Santiago Atitlan where Isabel lived. You were 3 hours away at your foster mother's house. 2 women from the agency left me standing there while they went to get Isabel. Neither of them spoke the Mayan language that Isabel spoke, but one of them had brought her English-speaking daughter along. I had my camera on a tripod, and a bunch of kids were laughing and jumping up to look in the lens. I could see bamboo shacks, and some were made of cement. And some men were hauling enormous sacks of coffee over there. They did not want me to take their picture, and I didn't. I was feeling nervous, and I wasn't sure what I was even going to say. Finally, a small woman came walking down a path with 2 kids trailing behind. Isabel.
I mean, did you just assume she would speak Spanish?
I guess I did. I just tried to explain who I was, but I felt ridiculous.
Yo soy de los Estados Unidos. I'm taking the little boy that was born to you 6 months ago. Muchas gracias por su hijo. No puedo haber hijos. No se puede haber hijos, mi y mi esposa. Entonces, it means the world to me that I have yours.
I can't have children with my husband, I told her. Every time I hear this audio, I feel awful for Isabel. And I'm sorry for you. Like, I wish I had better tape for you.
¿No entiende?
No entiendo.
De que le agradece por su hijo, porque ella no puede. Entonces, para ella significa muchísimo.
Isabel said she didn't understand, and she seemed upset. The adoption worker's daughter translated my English into the Spanish that Isabel didn't speak. She's grateful for your son because she couldn't have children. So for her, it means a lot. It means a whole world.
You know, I feel bad for Isabel, and I also feel bad for you, because I think although you're in 2 totally different situations, it's just so awkward for both of you.
Yeah, it was. And now I know we couldn't have met in a worse place. We were right down the path from Isabel's house. It was super public, and Isabel did not want to be seen with me. People here didn't know about the adoption.
That scene just is so powerful to me. The first thing I want to do is ask Diego, what was it like hearing that?
That tape where she first meets my mother, I think it's just so interesting to look back on it, because I think for me, and I think for Laurie and Isabel as well, they had no idea that this would blossom into what has been a 24-year-long relationship. And, you know, I think one of the big things that actually you hear us live digest and kind of realize was, I asked her, like, did you just assume she spoke Spanish? You know, and I think there's still things we're learning about each other and it, and, you know, that was kind of she always had tape of me, but this was kind of the point where things started to change and that relationship formed. So it's really quite powerful to see. And, you know, I see Laurie sometimes put her hands on her heads, you know, cover her face in shame because it's kind of embarrassing. I think it's kind of funny, though.
Diego, I have to say, while we were listening to that clip, I watched Laurie, and Laurie, it does seem really uncomfortable for you to hear that. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Oh, it's just really embarrassing because I'm an idiot in that scene. I'm like a clueless, oblivious, ugly American idiot. I mean, what was I thinking? There was, I think I said it. There were so many things wrong with what I did there. Like no sensitivity to the fact that people in the neighborhood might not know. We were in a part of the town where you don't see tourists or white people. And I had this video camera and I was thanking her for her baby. I mean, isn't it excruciating? Isn't it? But on the other hand, it's like, I wanted to share it because it's like how ignorant we can be, how clueless. And that is probably the best example of myself being that clueless, ignorant person.
Well, I just think that it's really brave that you were willing to share that very real moment and really allow yourself to kind of, just share that awkwardness. And it really got me, especially, I kept thinking if I was there, I probably would have been even speaking worse Spanish.
Yeah. And you would have done the same thing, I imagine, because you just ask. And, the whole project for Diego and me has been asking whoever might listen to like stop and think about what it is we're doing when we take babies from one place and put them in another. Like, what are we really doing and who is actually giving us those babies? That's really the main purpose, for me anyway, of wanting to do this whole thing.
What can you tell me about Diego's birth mother? Well,
I can tell you my version or I can tell you what the document said, because they're not the same. The document said she was 26 when she gave birth to him, and she was working as a domestic. I think it said she was not Maya, that she was illiterate. I mean, there was a social work report that came along with it that was just very condescending. I do know Spanish, even though I don't speak it very well still, but the descriptions were just, this woman is poor as dirt. She has no business raising another child. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but the Isabel that we came to know over, 24 years now, she loves to laugh. She leans on her other children who are now adults. She still lives in real poverty. I mean, she has corrugated roof and dirt floor and a couple of pails and pans hanging from the wall and, no running water that we could see or electricity or anything like that. And through the years always has been very emotional when she sees Diego, but really happy to see him.
When you were first getting to know her, what did you know about Diego's father?
He was kind of a boogeyman. All we heard about him, and it was from Isabel through a translator, was that he drank too much, that he was an alcoholic, that he came and went as he pleased, and he wasn't good to her. He didn't provide for her or his other children. So, no reason to really want to have much to do with him.
Do you remember Diego wondering about him when you were younger?
I think there was a time where, like I say, he's kind of a scapegoat, and I kind of use him as a person that I could blame troubles on. But beyond that, I never really wanted to know much about him. I didn't really care for a lot of that time. It's just kind of in the back of my mind.
So much of this podcast is about you, Diego, trying to make sense of your life and your identity and how it feels to live life in Minnesota with your adoptive family while thinking a lot about where you came from, your birth family, and the culture back in Guatemala. Diego, can you tell me what it was like growing up in Minnesota? Did you take to the culture?
Yeah, most definitely. When I say like things like you just said, like, or you betcha, I'll doing the occasional, oops, sorry. So, I picked up on those cues and, I just came from, I'm helping coach hockey at the high school I'm working at. And so, I've grown up playing hockey. I love snow. I love the cold. Yeah, I love football, kind of American things, buffalo wings, things like that.
When you were growing up, did you feel like you blended in with the culture there in the Twin Cities?
Not particularly well. For a lot of time, I was very unsure of who I was. I obviously never really looked like a hockey player, so that was kind of a real wake up where I was kind of, the only player of color on the team. And then, people would come up to me and speak in Spanish to me, and I would be like, I don't actually speak Spanish. And so it's just kind of this weird thing. And then, of course, I never quite felt like the name Diego fit me. And so it's just kind of this whole, like you said, I was really trying to figure out who I was and who I am.
And did you experience racism?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, playing hockey, there's definitely a lot of racism on the ice.
On the podcast, I hear you talk about enjoying talking smack and trash talk and stuff like that. So is that where you would hear a lot of that?
Of course, you try and get under people's skin as much as you can, as long as the ref doesn't hear it. And, so we talk a lot of stuff and a lot of smack. There was racial slurs thrown at me. I didn't throw any back, but it was just a lot of, jawing and again, just sometimes out in the community, walking around, people driving by, saying stuff to me, yelling out their window, stuff like that.
Do you remember, can you say one of the things that you heard?
Yeah, one of the things, so I was walking to school and I put my hand on the door, like I'm clearly going to school, and this truck drives by and it's like, go to school. And I was like, hey, I'm going to school, my guy. Like, I'm clearly going to school. It was kind of funny to me that happened, because I was, in the process of doing. So just, that's just one of the things that happen. And, that's the reality of being a brown person in the United States, or a person of color, not exclusive to just brown people, of course.
Right. Laurie, did this get reported back to you? Did you know he was going through this type of, you're shaking your head no.
He, by the time he was skating at high school, he wasn't telling me. He wasn't telling me. Mm-mm.
Diego, why not?
Kind of like we talk in the podcast, it's just something I didn't really think she'd have any experience with handling. It's not something that I can just tell her, I guess, and be like, yeah, you'll understand where I'm coming from, and you have been in a similar situation, and maybe you can give me some guidance on what to do. Is kind of like, well, I have to kind of figure this out on my own, especially, when we are out on the ice rink or out in the community. How do I conduct myself and stay cool, stay calm under pressure and being berated and things like that. But it was just something where I felt like our life experiences were too different.
But I get the feeling from the podcast that your mom is all in with you almost from the very beginning. And if something was not right with you, if somebody was giving you grief or being abusive to you in any way, I think it seems to me like she had your back. Was that not clear back then?
Yeah, it was definitely clear. And, I think, my Laurie and Dan have been two of my biggest supporters and continue to be my biggest supporters. And I'm very grateful for that. At the same time, it felt like there were some battles that I needed to learn how to fight on my own. And I don't know if that was me just being, trying to be a macho dude, or if that was me just, also being a young adult and learning, or if it was just me not seeing eye to eye in how racism works in the world.
Let me just interrupt and explain that what he just said about having to live in the world on his own, absolutely. But there were a couple times that, I was able to stick up for him in the way that I imagined I might have to when we adopted him. Like, I want to take on the racist systems. And there was a couple times that he got in trouble and the racism was evident to me. And it's really weird to say this, but it's also really true. I mean, like when he was in legal trouble and facing charges, I knew a prosecutor. And, I called him and he helped Diego out of this situation. And that's just privilege talking there.
Right. And, I've always explained it, especially, where I'm working right now, it's predominantly Black population of students. And, I tell them, yeah, I'm adopted. I have white parents. And so I have experienced white privilege through my parents, but that doesn't mean I don't have the experience of being a brown man growing up in the United States, because you can have one and the other. They're two separate things.
I've noticed during this conversation that you refer to your mother, your adoptive mother, as Laurie, and your adoptive father as Dan. But I haven't heard you call them mom and dad. And I guess I'm wondering, like, when did you start doing that? Or did you always call them by their first name?
Well, I think as I got older, I think I started to realize and be conscious that I do have two families. And part of me figuring out how do I deal with this was, so I decided to call Isabel my mother and Cristobal my father, and Laurie my mom, and Dan my dad. And then, just as I got older, I just started calling them Laurie and Dan. I don't really know why, actually.
When we come back after a break, Laurie and Diego talk about the experience of finally meeting Diego's father, Cristobal, Diego's experience studying abroad, and the lasting impacts they've gotten from producing this podcast.
To be in a city that embraced their history and their culture, and to be proud of their heritage and where they're from, I was like, this is so cool. Why have I not been proud of where I'm from? And so it made me rethink how I view indigeneity and my roots as a Mayan person, and really kind of say I'm from Guatemala.
I'm Trey Kay, and you're listening to Us and Them. This show is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. As I listened to Laurie Stern and her son Diego explain their international adoption story and some of the complications they've experienced, I learned how health issues can become complex when there's not much known about someone's medical history.
I can only speak for our experience. It makes sense that it would be, because you don't know the medical history. And
apparently it doesn't seem like it's in the International Adoptive Parent Handbook that they gave you.
No, I mean, there was one challenge that I won't say too much about because it's kind of gets revealed in the podcast. But, I was calling around trying to figure out how other adoptive parents got information about what to do, and there was just nothing.
Yeah. What do you remember about that, Diego?
Yeah, I mean, health issues definitely made things more complicated. The first thing they will often ask you if you go in for an exam or some type of health issue is, do you have any relatives or any family members that have a similar condition or something like that? And, for us, it would just be like, I don't know. We don't know. And that made a lot of the diagnoses really difficult because it wasn't something you could compare me to. It wasn't something that we could look at the blood work of Laurie and Dan and be like, okay, here we go. We know what we need to do and what it is. It was just a very interesting dilemma, I will say. There was a lot of pressure on me, and for a lot of going through that sickness and being sick, I felt like I couldn't break. If I broke, then the family would break. It was a lot of pressure. And again, like I said, with the camera and the microphone, it was never like, yeah, let's let you learn what grief is and kind of be able to process kind of what you're going through on your own. And, you know, it was like, okay, you're sick. How do you feel right now? And so and you know, it's that thing where I think I kind of learned what to say and how to present myself regardless of how I feel, to just kind of, you know, answer it like, yeah, it's no big deal, and to not get too deep, or to just brush the surface and give them enough that they would be like, all right, and not really tell them how it is. So that was one of the big struggles for me, and it was a lot of pressure, and, you know, I never felt like I really got to experience my feelings on my own.
Just moving forward a little bit, one part of the series that really got to me, Diego, it's you'd gotten through your teen years, which doesn't sound like it was any small feat, and you're in college, and at some point you're studying abroad in Italy. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so I went to Italy, and I went and lived in Rome for like 11 months, give or take. And it was just, one of the things I experienced there was, on the surface, whenever let's say you go to, you know, you're brand new at a job, or you're brand new at, you know, whatever company, and they're like, all right, we're going to do some icebreakers. And like, one of the most common questions is, where are you from? And for me, this has always been the most difficult question anyone can ask me, because there's just so much going on. And when I was in Italy, people would ask me, like, di dove sei, where are you from? And I was like, well, I don't know, actually. And it was kind of this freeing thing where, you know, when I go back to Guatemala, I look Mayan, I look like I'm from Guatemala, I look like I'm with my people, but I wear American clothing, so it's kind of off-putting. And then when I'm here, I look like I might be Hispanic, and so there's just so much. And when I'm in Italy and Rome, no one knew where I was from. So I'd walk into a store, and they'd be like looking at me curiously, kind of like, what language do I speak to this dude? And it was so cool, because they would talk to me in Italian, and I'd answer in Italian, or they'd talk to me in Spanish, and I'd answer in Spanish or English, and I could be where I wanted to be from. And I ended up studying ancient Rome. And long story short, it was just to be in a city that embraced their history and their culture, and to be proud of their heritage and where they're from. I was like, this is so cool. Why have I not been proud of where I'm from? And so it made me rethink how I view indigeneity and my roots as a Mayan person, and really kind of say I'm from Guatemala.
Another thing that I thought about then is, there you are in Italy. It seems as like there's this constant internal conflict. Like, on one hand, you are really grateful that you were adopted, and that you kind of have the opportunity to go to college, and that you are able to visit Rome, and this is something that many of your siblings, at least as far as I know, haven't. That's an opportunity that they have not been able to have. So you feel grateful for that, and on the other hand, you feel disconnected from the culture that you were taken from. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I feel I'm very grateful for the opportunities I've had. I understand I've had a lot of privilege. I'm alive today because I'm adopted. I've gotten to experience the world in a whole different way than what my siblings in Guatemala have. And on the other hand, I also feel like I'm not really contributing to the community that I was born into, that I'm from. And that's always been something that kind of weighs on me, where yes, I have all this privilege, but what do I do with it? Because I cannot speak Sutuhil. I don't really know how to conduct myself as a Sutuhil man. And I spend a lot of time pondering these questions.
In the 8 episodes of Defining Diego, there are so many emotionally gripping and thought-provoking scenes. We not only get to know you and Dan and Laurie very well, but we also get to know the birth family and other important people in the place of your origin. There's one scene that really resonated with me throughout the series, and I'd asked before about your father and like what it is that we knew about him, and we know that his name is Cristobo, and what we'd heard before really wasn't very positive. And I'd like to play this excerpt about Cristobo and then speak with you on the other end.
I remember Dan was standing in the doorway, and I just heard Dan say, "You must be Cristobo."
It's Cristobal.
Hola.
Cristobal was smaller than me and older than I thought he'd be. His back was bent and his jeans hung on him. His brown fleece jacket was zipped all the way up. He had bushy eyebrows under a faded San Francisco Giants baseball cap. He looked beat up.
Cristobal. Inin nubi atiko. Hola.
I'd practiced how to say, "I am your son, Atiko," in Sutuhio. I wanted to give him a hug, but I stopped myself, and instead, I put out my hand. There we were, shaking hands, and the last piece of my puzzle slipped into place.
Diego, what was it like meeting your birth father?
You know, I think it was something that I had always told myself, you don't really have to do it. And, you know, honestly, if I hadn't met him, I don't think I would have really been, like, torn up about it or complained, because it was just one of those things where he's just never available. So, you know, expectations are never there.
But am I imagining something in the when I listen to it, it sounds like you are really in kind of in it seems like a kind of an anxious anticipation to meet him.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, when we got there, he wasn't there. So we were just like, well, okay, same old, same old. And then Isabel went to go get him and he walks in, and it was just kind of this thing where I'm not an anxious person. I don't really get nervous. I don't, you know, and this was one time where it was kind of like, do I have to size myself up because of the stories I've heard? Do I have to, like, how do I present myself? Am I going to be asking him questions about things in the past? Like, you know, I didn't have anything prepared because I didn't know if it was going to happen. But, you know, as I shook his hand, it was kind of just like this calmness that came over me where I felt like here we are, two families in one world. And it felt nice to kind of know and have some closure.
To me, it seems like you just talking about it right now feels like it's an emotional, it feels emotional just remembering it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something. I don't know if I'll ever meet him again. You know, he wasn't in great shape, and he admitted that himself. And, you know, it was one of those things where, you know, learning his story and learning more about him, I kind of learned more about my people and my culture. And, you know, it was life-changing, as I say, because I learned his name, his full name, Cristobal Tsina Rajuk. And, you know, like I said, I've always been playing around with my names and trying to figure out, which one fits me. And so I didn't know I needed it, but it happened, and it was something I did need that I just didn't admit.
And it seems, as I understand it, when you say that the final piece kind of fit in, you've kind of made a transformation, if I'm not mistaken. You are choosing not to go by the name Diego anymore.
Yeah. So, you know, as we start the podcast, it's Diego Shikai Luke. And, you know, I was kind of hesitant about using this name. It never quite felt like it fit me. I had tried, you know, my birth mother's name, Petse, and it felt cool, but not right. And then when I met Cristobal, I learned his last name, and, you know, putting them together, learning his history, his story, you know, I felt this responsibility to kind of shoulder the traumas of him and Isabel and my people and my culture. Yeah, so I actually decided to change my name to Atiko Rajuk Shikai, and that actually goes into effect January 15th, 2023. I'd kind of been hesitant to pull the trigger, and this is kind of a goofy story, but I love superhero movies. You hear this in the series, but I had just seen Black Panther Wakanda Forever, and there's this guy Namor, and he's from the Yucatan, and they're Maya. And so it was really cool to see people like me on screen. And he was embracing his heritage. And I was like, that's the most badass thing. And so, like, literally the next day I went in and was like, I'm embracing my Mayan heritage. I'm going to change my name to Atiko.
That's a great name.
Like, on my hockey jersey now, it's pretty cool. It says Rujok Shikai. I'm very proud of it. It's kind of a name that I feel like it's so unique. It fits me, and it's, you know, pays homage to Cristobal and Shikai. And I know it's really hard when I came home for Laurie and Dan, because as you hear in this podcast, I think it's in episode 6, if I'm not mistaken, where we talk about my name, and it's kind of like we chose these names deliberately. We handpicked each one, and it's kind of like a big middle finger to say, you know, you chose wrong. But it just, it's a shift for everyone.
Laurie, what about that? I mean, he has chosen a name that is different than the one that you gave him. How did you feel about that?
Well, it was a little annoying because, you know, we thought we had thought it through, because the name, his formal name until was Diego Mac Shikai Luke. And Diego was the name that he came with. I mean, it's traditional in his village to name the firstborn boys Diego. Ko, though, is how you say Diego in the Maya language of the village. So didn't know that when we gave him his name. And then Mac is for my grandpa, which is the Jewish tradition, is to name someone for a late beloved person. And Shikai was his mother's name, his mother's last name, and Luke is Dan's last name. So we thought by giving him these 4 names, he could pick whichever one he liked. And then he went and picked something completely different.
So, Laurie, there was a question you posed early in the series, and that is, should you adopt a baby from another country just because you can? And after you've been through this experience and you've learned about what this is, how it's worked out for your son, the positive and the negative, and in many ways, how you've seen the international adoption process change and what you have observed by it, how would you answer that question today?
Should you adopt a baby from another culture just because you can? I would say no, you shouldn't. There should be safeguards and thoughtfulness. And I mean, in the years that international adoption was peaking in the late 90s and through most of the 2000s, it seemed to me that most people weren't thinking it through. If you're an adoptive parent, you wanted a baby. If you were in the hustle somewhere in a poor country, you wanted income. Everybody that we talked to in adoption said that they were thinking about what was in the best interest of the children. But I don't think they were. And now I just think it's a good question, and I don't have the answer to it. I think that the cultural lens has shifted, and we don't do that anymore. We don't move children from their biological, their birth environments and their cultures. We do think about it, or we're learning to. And the real solution, I think, even in our case, would be if we were going to do what was in the best interest of the children, maybe we would figure out how to support the families and communities they're born into. But, you know, I wanted a baby, and this was a way I could get one. I mean, we don't even know, even after all the times we've asked the question, we don't know how much agency Isabel had in the decision to relinquish Diego. We know that the adoption facilitators kind of recruited her, as they recruited a lot of birth mothers. They planted the idea. We also know from talking to an anthropologist who works in indigenous communities that there had been informal adoption for decades and generations before international adoption became a thing. I just want us to think about them.
Well, you know the name of my show.
Uh-huh.
And you and I talked about this. I think this is a very us-y and them-y topic.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all in the podcast, and we've already said it. I mean, there's privilege and there's not privilege. And those power dynamics play out all the time. But I think international adoption, it's really stark. I mean, there's us who get babies from them who give babies. And they don't get anything. They don't get our $20,000. We get a family. That's pretty us-y and them-y.
Yeah. Atiko, it seems like working on this show has really helped you figure out who you are and where you fit into the world. Do you think you would have had the same journey if not for working on this show?
I don't think so. Like I said, Cristobal was kind of this piece that I didn't want to admit I was missing. I think, it was a project that I wasn't really looking forward to doing, because it was really just asking me, yes, let's relive 23 years of pain and trauma and like some of the hardest moments of your life. And that frightened me. But I'm very glad I did it, because, we did get a lot out of it. I got a lot out of it. And, I hope listeners get something out of it. Meeting Cristobal, I always wondered about myself. I consider myself a very resilient person and like a survivor. I definitely think, I kind of always wondered where I got that from. And after meeting Cristobal, I realized this is where I get my resilience and just refusal to die. From. And Isabel, I think I get this selflessness, this wanting to give back and wanting to do whatever you can even when you have nothing. It kind of helped me understand myself.
It was a pleasure meeting you. And Laurie, I am so proud of the work that you've done. And to both of you, this story was incredibly moving, and I hope that others are going to check it out. Thank you so much for speaking to us about it.
Thank you so much for caring about it, Trey.
Thanks for having us, Trey.
We've been talking to Laurie Stern and Atiko Shikai about the podcast they produced with Sony and something else called Defining Diego. It's the story about Atiko learning to navigate his life and identity after being adopted by an American couple back in the 1990s. Hearing Atiko's story is a powerful lesson in learning how to accept who you are. And hearing Laurie's side of the story reminds me that as a parent, you can't protect your children from everything. And the most important thing that we can do is give our kids information about themselves and the world around them, and ultimately let them make their own decisions about how their future will unfold. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode was me, Trey Kay, Samantha Gatzik, and Kate Smith. Special thanks to Laurie Stern and Atiko Shikai. Michael Lipton, Tristam Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, and the CRC Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.